All right, coming as this is just before the American holiday of Thanksgiving, I'll start off with talking about a little bit of that historical backstory, because part of the African American experience is talking about some of the backstory behind the things that we take for granted. So I'll start by giving thanks, I suppose, that we live in America. So George Washington started the first national celebration of Thanksgiving, but the tradition of giving thanks is universal.
Gotta power your mic. They still can hear you through the ceiling.
They can still?
You
Okay.
sound a little echoey.
What?
All right.
All right.
Sorry.
It's all right. So in Turtle Island, the tradition of giving thanks every day for a new day, as well as giving in a gift economy, was present certainly long before Washington or even the United States. There was a piece on alternative radio yesterday by the late Russell Means, who basically talked about how in a place where, you know, the way natives basically see the land that they're on, like the Aleutians with the Aleuts, place where it's cold, wet, rainy, it's paradise to them. To the Inuit, living above the Arctic Circle, that's paradise for them. The Hopi, who basically plant corn, squash, and beans, which are all water-intensive crops, without irrigation and have them thrive in a desert. That's paradise for them. So they give thanks in each of their ways. So within a gift economy, what that means is the gifts that you give are not necessarily material things, but you give of your time, your wisdom, and peace. So not necessarily consuming in a consumer economy, which, you know, when we have these references to Black Friday and all that, it's the only time that the word black is actually even positive. Because, you know, in the profit margins, it's usually the day that most consumer goods are sold in America. So that's an interesting thing. So give thanks for your freedom and give to make sure that you stay free. And so remember the story. So the idea about talking about this from partially the native experience in terms of looking at the mythology that kind of grew up around Thanksgiving, the image of who the Pilgrims were and the Puritans, et cetera, et cetera. There is another side, which I'm not telling you this to like put you on a guilt trip or whatever, but to understand how stories change, and often lots of little details get glossed over and left out. And so instead of, you know, yeah, we have turkey, and yeah, we have this and that, and it's time for family and all that, but there's more complex things. So what does Thanksgiving symbolize to you according to the traditional canon? That's a question you can answer.
I get to eat a lot of food.
Okay, eating a lot of food.
And occasionally spend some time with family.
Occasionally spend time with family. Okay. All right. Okay. What else? Or who else?
For us, it's like family oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody brings something to the table during that day.
Okay. All right. Bringing something to the table, and that also presumes there's a table and a home and all that other kind of stuff. So if you're not doing anything else, you can go participate in the Whitaker dinner, because our culinary program goes and cooks for that all the time. And so folks who don't have homes or whatever, this is still America, so we can, celebrate our largesse and by giving. Anyone else?
Football.
Football. American style football, not soccer.
Yeah.
Though I wonder if there are any Thanksgiving soccer games.
ES221 Cowboys played in Redskins.
Okay. Football, all right. Yes, with the advent of television, we got football. So what else?
I actually think it's kind of funny that the Cowboys play the Redskins on Thanksgiving. I never noticed that until now.
I think it's symbolic, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if they always do, but there have been other times that they have played. Right, so football, an American version of rugby and other games, right? And the Cowboys versus the Indians, or the Redskins, so to speak. All right. So indigenous cultures and tradition gave thanks to Creator not once a year, but every harvest of agriculture or game. Indeed, when you go out hunting, as Russell Means talked about in his talk, about indigenous cultures basically having a balance of male and female principles, you pray before you go hunting, and you also pray to thank the game after you've killed it, and you use every part of it. So Thanksgiving isn't just one day, it's every day that you're getting something and also giving something. So you're at least giving thanks and gratitude, and as well as receiving the necessities for life. So these Thanksgiving festivals often lasted several days if we're talking about harvest of agriculture. So one such celebration occurred August of 1621 at Patuxent, also anglicized as New Plymouth, now known as Plymouth Rock. So naturally this is Indian country, and so probably you didn't necessarily know that, right, the first Thanksgiving happened in August, when it was stormy and cold and wet, not November. Okay, this is the historical bet we are taught to picture as the quote-unquote first Thanksgiving. A cold and windy night, August 11th, 1620. The Mayflower is forced to anchor in the Bay of Paumet, also known as Cape Cod. So notice, the juxtaposition of the Algonquin words with the English words. Right? This continent had names and places had names before 1492. April showers bring Mayflowers, and Mayflowers bring pilgrims. So they were heading to Jamestown, Virginia. Now Jamestown is named after King James of England, creator of the King James Version of the Bible, and it's virgin territory, and so this is the sacred virgin, hence Virginia. So, like Columbus, the Pilgrims were lost.
You get navigators back in the day.
Well, what you need is an African navigator, I'm telling you. You want to go from Europe to here. Get yourself a Moorish navigator. So, running low on supplies, religious leaders William Bradford, Edward Winslow, following a guidebook published in Europe titled Virginia, Richly Valued, they decided to raid graves for food. Now, whose graves were they raiding? Native people who, following a particular custom, not only buried their dead, either underground or in scaffolds, depending on which part of the country we're talking about. If they buried their dead, they usually buried the dead with supplies for the afterlife. So not only the jewelry and other things that you wore in life, but also food for the journey. Corn and all this other kind of stuff. So they decide to raid graves for food. Now, what would Europeans think about other folks raiding graves for food? What would they do with those folks? Well, one, is that allowed? No. What would you do with such people if you found out about it?
Then or now?
Then.
Probably kill him.
Okay. Well, that didn't happen. They were discovered by the Samoset, a band of Algonquins, who chased them off the Cape because of their sacrilege. So, didn't kill them, but yeah, leave now. Otherwise, we will off you. So, the Algonquins themselves were part of what was referred to back then as the League of the Delaware, which for 600 years prior had been defending themselves from the Iroquois, that is, the Iroquois Six Nations that we learned about earlier. So the Delaware have been defending themselves from Iroquois, European slavers, and encounters with European fishermen and explorers. And so ever since Columbus discovered Turtle Island, other Europeans were coming to what we refer to now as the East Coast, as well as Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so New York City used to be New Amsterdam with the Dutch, et cetera. Harlem is a Dutch word, right? So there were successive European immigrants coming to basically the East Coast since then. And of course, lots of different Indian nations. So understand the Iroquois Confederacy, even though it was founded by the great peacemaker to basically stop war, wars were happening anyway with various other nations, including the Algonquins and the League of the Delaware. So the Wampanoags, in particular, did not fully trust white people because of the slavers who raided their coastal villages. But encountering the Pilgrims, their religion taught them they were to give charity to the helpless and hospitality to anyone who came to them with empty hands. Now, the Wampanoags are also known as the people of the Eastern Gate. That is, at one point, the farthest point east where you see the sunrise first. And as part of the League of Delaware, because remember, this is not all that far away. Plymouth Rock is not all that far away from Cape Cod. So there's different territories. So Wampanoags were the ones who made first contact with the people that we call the Pilgrims. And their religion, their spirituality taught them they were to give charity to the helpless and hospitality to those who came to them with empty hands. So Pilgrims had left Cape Cod and landed at Plymouth. The Wampanoags welcomed another Algonquin band. So basically, if I show you essentially the difference, legally, Indian nations, and the reason I refer to them as Indian nations, legally, Indian nations, the idea that they're a nation with the same legal status as Germany, France, etc. Right? Any European nation. Concept of sovereignty. Okay, and some degree of autonomy, but technically what happens with Indian nations is they are domestic, dependent nations. Okay, meaning they're sovereign on their own lands, but they depend on the United States for military protection. And part of where their protection is from various states. So basically, the United States to native nations is basically a state-to-state relationship. That is, a sovereign state's relationship to a sovereign state. So what happens on a reservation basically is, like you're going to a separate country. Now, in our language, say again?
So reservations are like terrible these days, though. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, there's like some good ones, but there's some pretty sketchy ones.
Well, yes, because if their traditional lands basically supplied them with everything they needed, and that becomes a housing development, well, you can't hunt on it anymore. Right? So essentially, their traditional lands have been kind of shrunk through a series of different policies. So that increases the dependency. The reason I'm pointing this out in terms of within an Indian nation, so you can have like the Wampanoag nation, which in English we often refer to as a tribe. And the problem with using that word, even though you'll even find native people using that word, is that the use of the word tribe psychologically diminishes them. The legal status is nation, but we refer to them as tribes. And it's not just semantics, it's basically, tribes they're savages. Because who are they? We don't recognize their government unless they basically adopt a governmental form similar to us, which we got from them, but that gets erased. Right? So, within particular nations, they also have bands. So a band is basically a collection of family groups. So it could be 200 to a couple of thousand folks. But usually the latter, 200. A local group. And then a group of bands, because remember, we're also talking about within bands, you can also have clans, just like the Iroquois clan system. Other groups also use the matrilineal clan system. So when they're referring to bands, so Welcome Pilgrims, another Algonquin band. So Algonquin is not only a name for, it's basically a language group. Basically, so several different nations can share that same language. Samoset, Sagamore, Algonquins, the Moraticans.
Not sure what's going on. We're getting just a blast on the mic there. Don't know what's going on. Let's
Switch out the bat.
No, it's still running.
Okay.
But let's try clipping it back here.
All right.
To make sure.
The entire cord's probably hot, right? Not just the tip. That could be it. Thanks.
What's going on?
All right, so Samoset was on a fishing trip visiting the Wampanoags when he walked into the Pilgrims' camp on Friday the 16th, 1621, bidding them welcome in English. Now, eyebrows may be raised, but again, this is one of the things that I point out that it's similar both on Turtle Island and in Africa. The norm was multilingualism. Okay? Trading is going on across the continent and had been going on across the continent for millennia. So it's only proper, basically the reason I can say Turtle Island is like, what we call North, Central, and South America. Okay? One land, many nations, no borders. when you travel from one place to another, if you knew that there was another either nation, band, or whatever, you could see signs of native civilization, the polite thing to do is stop at, the outside of where you can see the tribe gathering, because there's a camp, because there's smoke, there's, people hunting, there might be people going back and forth. You stop, make a fire, show that you're there, and then somebody contacts you. And then you can give a gift or whatever. And so it's not like borders. It's not like a border patrol. It's just politeness. You're moving from one place to another. And then if they get to know you, then obviously you don't have to do the fire thing. You're welcome if you're a stranger making first contact, right? So the norm with Native Americans was speaking multiple languages, not only with other Native people, but with any Europeans that came as well. Learning their languages. Because this is a basic human capability. Remember, a human baby's brain is a computer that is formatted to learn each and every language that's spoken around it by association. Right? So some of us basically put that within our cultures and basically learn to speak that. So Samoset bidding them welcome in English is only surprising if you didn't know that those folks did that. Throwing pens around. So it's normal for them to speak English, French, Dutch, German even. Hello, Englishman. They noted he was a man of free speech as far as he could express his mind. Samoset spent the night with the Pilgrims, described the countryside, the province, every sagamore, the numbers in their bands, and left in the morning. So he's basically orienting them to the country they in. In particular, he returned a few weeks later with the person that is known as Squanto. So, Squanto, not the name his mama gave him, the name the whites associated with him, was a Patuxent who had been captured by European slavers and shipped off to England. He remained long enough to be baptized as a Christian, learn English, and eventually got back to America. About 2 miles from his village, once he got back to America, he was captured again by English slavers and shipped off to England.
Isn't that like funny? It's just, that's a terrible...
Yeah. Okay, so, right. This is the guy who, they even made a movie, Squanto, blah, 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 like, okay, really?
Wouldn't they be like a little curious, like, wow, this is like an educated human being, like, or they just not care?
Yeah, right. Okay, right. You would think that, but...
Excuse me, fellas, I'm not a slave anymore.
Yeah. But they may or may not care. So he was shipped off to England again. He had a deep friendship with a British explorer named John Weymouth, who had been like a second father to him for several years before he encountered the Pilgrims. Again, remember, so this is now 2 trips to England as a slave. He comes back. So when he finally returned to his village, the entire village had been wiped out due to a, quote, mysterious plague. Now, what the plague could have been is probably not bubonic plague, though that's possible. If we look at the history of other indigenous people making first contact with Europeans, common cold, measles, smallpox, any number of things could have done it. So, he returns to his village. The entire village is wiped out. This is after the second escape from slavery. And the Pilgrims were living on the land they now called New Plymouth. basically on the site of his village. When I first heard this story, and every time I actually present this, I wonder, what could he have been thinking himself? Well, what he decided to do was teach the pilgrims how to plant corn, fertilize earthen mounds with fish, either herring or shads, basically improving or replenishing the land once you plant. The following fall, after hunting fowl, the pilgrims harvested 20 acres of corn, 6 acres of barley, and peas, thanks to Squanto's tutelage. So barley can make bread, but it can also make
Beer.
So pilgrims themselves were a subset of Puritans, and far from being religious refugees, eventually engineered coming to power in England, abolishing Parliament for a time. They invited the Sachem Wusamaquin, also known as Chief Masoit, he was Wampanoag, to celebrate their harvest. The chief brought 5 deer, 90 men, and so the first Thanksgiving, a bird, corn, peas, roasted venison, and beer, of course. This feast lasted 5 days and was celebrated as a treaty by which the pilgrim could have a permanent settlement. Now, understand one of the things that's happened from one of the stories that happens from this time is in Turtle Island, like in Africa, we didn't believe in real estate. Okay? Real estate comes from the Spanish real kings, estate, lands. Okay? So the land belonged to the king, and everything on the land, including its people, were the king's property. That's where that whole concept of first night's rights comes from. Well, the king can sleep with your wife because you and your wife are king's property. You ain't got nothing to say about it. You can't hunt the king's deer because even if you're starving, you hunt the king's deer. Well, that's like stealing from the king. Death sentence. Right? So English common law. So the idea of real estate, the permanent settlement was this. Yes, you can have the land, but you don't own the land. In fact, some of the natives said, you can have as much land as a person can walk in a day. So what happened is some of these pilgrims hired distance runners. Kind of violating the spirit of generosity, but okay. So, the treaty, so that they could have a permanent settlement. Though if the chief, of course, had known about the grave desecration in search of corn to eat and personal artifacts of the dead to sell to finance their debt, basically finance their debt back home because they basically had paid money